Good day, Lionhearts. It's your old pal, Jordan the Lion, and we are still in Sydney, Australia, and today we are doing some rock and roll. Literally, like when I think of the word rock and roll, the term rock and roll, I think of this band. They're originally from Scotland, but they started here. They moved here, they started here, and for those about to rock, we salute you. Daze with Jordan the Lion begins now. All right, so what we're off to do today is we are going to take a tour around Sydney and show you some houses and different places connected to Acdc, or as the people here call it, Acdc. So our first stop is going to be in the district of Burwood. Now we are in Burwood. Well, we are right around the corner from the home that Acdc started in. This very well could have been their church. It's literally right around the corner. So in 1963, Scotland at the time had its worst snowstorm in history. It was 8 feet of snow. And so a travel company made an ad saying that they would help facilitate anyone that wanted to start a new life by moving to Australia. So in 1963, June, the Young family, 15 members of them, including George, Angus, Malcolm, their parents, their sisters, they all moved here to Sydney, Australia. Now first, they stayed at what was called a migrant hostel. And now, we were actually gonna go out there, but when I started reading about it online, it just sounded so freaking depressing that now it's an immigrant detention center for people that have overstayed their visas, and I read all kinds of things about how there were like human mistreatment cases going on about that, so I just decided not to go there. But that's where they first landed when they got to Sydney. But then the family soon moved into a house, and we are now going to show you where at 8 years old, Angus Young and his family moved into, and eventually Acdc was born out of this house. Right here at this, what is now a family medical practice house, is where the Young family moved into. Now Angus said that there were always instruments around the house, even though his parents didn't play any instruments. All the siblings did, so they had pianos and saxophones and guitars and everything, and he said it was just, you know, byproduct of them being around, he learned how to play them and developed a major love for it. Now there's a rumor that the reason that Angus performs in lederhosen was because that was his schoolboy uniform. Well, it was, and they said that the reason that he started doing this was because he was so eager to get home from school that he would not even take those clothes off and he would start playing his guitar. But what I found out, another story about this, was that his sister Martha, she helped them come up with that gimmick. You see, she had seen the word Acdc written on a sewing machine, and the brothers liked it and decided that that's what they wanted to name their band. So the band started out of here. Now, originally, when they were at that first migrant hostel that I told you about, their older brother George met a man there, and those two became partners and started a band called the Easy Beats. So the Easy Beats actually became a really, really popular 60s band here in Australia. So from the time that they landed and they met, they basically started a band and became popular. So this ended up helping facilitate the brothers to start their band. You see, Malcolm ended up going to Newcastle, and he was in a band there called Velvet Underground. Not the Velvet Underground with Lou Reed, but an Australian version of Velvet Underground. And when that didn't work out, he came back here, decided he was gonna form a new band, and wanted a second guitar player, and the obvious choice was his kid brother, Angus. Now Angus said he wasn't really a great guitar player at first. He said, you know, he couldn't listen to a song and figure it out on guitar, but his brother Malcolm was really good at that, so he said he would wait for Malcolm to figure out the songs, and then he would just watch Malcolm play them and he would learn them that way. But they started playing together as Acdc in 1973 with a guy singing named Dave Evans. And originally they were kind of a glam band, and so that's where the lederhosen came in. They were looking for a gimmick, and they had dressed up Angus as Spider-Man and Zorro and as a gorilla and like some weird offshoot of Superman, and nothing really seemed to work. And he was an introvert, and so he said, you know, when I put on the lederhosen, that schoolboy uniform, it kind of made me feel like I had to be an extrovert. And he always liked to kind of hide in the back when they play, and Malcolm said, no, you're a good guitar player, get out front and show it off. So that's kind of where his stage performance started to come from, was being kind of ushered along by his brother telling him to do it. Now Malcolm was really always the kind of the leader and the brains behind Acdc, and so the band initially started playing gigs, and they were doing pretty well, and then they got a gig going up to Adelaide, and while they were up there they just kind of felt like their singer wasn't maybe the best guy for the job, and they had gotten a gig opening for Lou Reed, and on that tour somebody said, hey, we got a guy that's going to drive you around, show you the sights and stuff, and they see this van driving up the road, swerving and everything, and they say it's Bon Scott. And they had known Bon Scott because they'd seen him perform in bands and everything, and they said he wasn't a good driver, but we were like, you know, maybe he could be our singer. So they asked him if he would be the singer, and he said, I don't know, I'll think about it. Go ahead and go do your other gigs, and when you come back through, look me up and I'll let you know what I think. And so they did that. He ended up going from being their driver on this tour to their lead singer. Now the band released an album, and it was a lot of covers and kind of like instrumental songs that they put together. It wasn't really what they would later be known for, but once they got the band solidified with Bon Scott and the two brothers, then they went out and they started performing, and they made a real record with George, their older brother. He helped get the band going, and then they got booked for the Sunbury Festival in 1975, and they ended up not even getting to perform because somebody in Deep Purple's entourage, one of their roadies, hit one of Acdc's roadies, and when Acdc found out about it, a whole big melee broke out, and it ended up basically shutting down the festival. And the next day they had made headlines because they had had a big brawl with Deep Purple. So basically from 1975 on, this band made some of the most incredible music, some of the most memorable songs of all time in rock and roll history. They've went down as one of the top 10 greatest rock bands of all time, and like I introduced, they really are the epitome of rock and roll. They've been called metal and hard rock and blues based, and they've been called all these things, but when it comes down to it, Angus said, we are just a rock and roll band. We just go up there to rock. They went long and hard, and they partied hard in those early days in the late 70s, and eventually Bon Scott, you know, they said this guy was legendary. They said he could line up like 4 or 5 glasses of bourbon and like a line of speed, do it all, to the point where they said this guy's not even going to be able to stand up. And then he'd go out and perform an amazing show until 1980, when he died of alcohol poisoning. Now they had finished up Highway to Hell right before he had passed, and so they contemplated disbanding. They put the album out, and the album did really well, and so they ended up finding Brian Johnson and inviting Brian Johnson to join the band, which he did, and then they made Back in Black, and that has went on to be one of the largest selling albums of all time. I think it's like number 3 of all time for like a rock band. They've sold over 20 million copies of that record, and they went on strong for the next 30 years. It wasn't really until about 2014 where things broke down. See, unfortunately in 2014, Malcolm Young, the leader of this band, the man who was primarily the songwriter and really was the driving force behind it, was showing signs of dementia and had to leave the band. So this is what the neighborhood looks like now. I was ringing the doorbell. Since it's a doctor's office, I thought maybe I could get in there and look around, because I haven't seen anybody coming and going. Maybe they're not too busy today, but nobody's answering and the door's locked. But now I'm standing on their front doorstep. I can't believe it. If you know the song High Voltage, the reason they wrote that was because their older brother George said, you know, if you're gonna call yourself Acdc, you should write a song that has those chords that are, it's basically played Acdc. And so that's how High Voltage came about. So it's literally an Acdc anthem. So now we're gonna take off from the old home here that they lived at, and we're gonna take you over to where Malcolm Young lived here in Sydney, Australia. So the other night we went out to a place called Frankie's Pizza, and my friend Barry drove me around, told me, hey, Malcolm Young's son was there that night and you didn't meet him. His name, you said Ross?
Ross Young, yep.
Yeah,
Ross
man,
Young. How
did I not know that? Now we're in the area called Balmain. So here was his estate. It was a pretty big place. It was called Onkaparinga is what the actual house's name was. It was a historic boarding house built in 1937, and when he bought it, it was actually in disrepair. It was falling apart, and they actually called it the Cockroach Castle. So he bought it, and he didn't live here that often. He owned it for a long time, but they said he was just touring and recording and everything so much, rehearsing, that he would mainly come back and spend his Christmases here and hang out at the neighborhood pubs. Now I believe his family still owns it, and he would spend his later days here. Now what was sad is that in 2010 they started noticing there was something wrong. He had been treated for lung cancer, and he was having some other health issues. And then in 2014, the band announced that he was going to be taking a small hiatus. And then it was announced that it was going to be a permanent hiatus, and they ended up having to move Malcolm into a full-time nursing home where he could be cared for. It's pretty sad. He had developed dementia, and they said primarily it was extremely poor short-term dementia, so it was really hard to function. And he was in that nursing home from 2014 until he passed away in 2017. We can't find exactly where they buried him, but we do know where the funeral was, and there were some kind of touching moments at the funeral. So we're going to go to St. Mary's Church back in the heart of Sydney, and we're going to see where they had his funeral. So where this sandstone wall starts, his property takes up this entire block. It goes up there and it goes all the way around. It takes up the entire section. So looking out from the house, if you were up there on the balcony, this is what you would see looking out at the harbor. You got to admit, that's a pretty nice place for a guy who started out his Sydney life here in a immigrant hostel. We're walking along here, and I was telling Barry, you know, the crazy thing is there are probably some of his guitars, at least one of them, still in there somewhere. And there's the front porch. Here's the front entrance. You can kind of see the entryway. There's some little animal statues in there. Well, here we are, November 28th, 2017. They had Malcolm Young's funeral service here. So the entrance that we just showed you is actually where when they ended the service, they brought his casket out through. So we're gonna go inside, take a look, and then we'll come out that same side and show you some photos from that day. So the funeral service was attended by many of the members of the band. Phil Rudd, Cliff Williams, Angus, and everybody that came was given an Acdc guitar pick with Malcolm's initials. So during the ceremony, they had Malcolm's casket up here on the altar, and they had one of his guitars laying across the top of the casket. And on the outside of Malcolm's casket, they had a plaque that said Malcolm Mitchell Young, and it had this on top of it, this crucifixion. So as the service ended, they brought Malcolm's casket out this doorway ahead of us, followed by Angus carrying Malcolm's guitar in a case, and they played the song Waltzing Matilda on bagpipes. They would have brought him right out these doors. And when they came out here, thousands of fans were lined up along the street. And there's a photo of Angus right here where I'm standing, walking out. Right here you can see Angus walking out of these doors, carrying that guitar case. And them also bringing the casket out through here. Right to a hearse that was waiting right here with, like I said, thousands of adoring fans up and down the street. As the service ended and they brought the casket out to the hearse and started driving it away, they had the Scots College pipes out here playing It's a Long Way to the Top if you want to rock and roll. What a fitting way to go. It was said that Malcolm's family was too broken up to speak, but that they wanted to make sure that Malcolm was remembered for being a generous and kind man, as well as phenomenal rock musician. Well, my friends, we're gonna call it a day. I hope you enjoyed this ACDC vlog today. I want to thank Jackie Dawson and Marcia Sullivan for becoming my newest Patreons. Come back and see me tomorrow. We'll have another great vlog planned for you. Have a good night and goodbye.